So I just want to say hello and welcome to the next installment of the UMD iSchool's Socio-Technical Cybersecurity Lecture Series. And I'm going to then introduce Dean Marzullo for a few words before our speaker today, Dr. Jason Nurse. Dean Marzullo.
Good afternoon. It's great seeing you all here, virtually here. This is our penultimate session in this series. We'll be having one more. That's going to be on May 12th. May 13th. I'm sorry, May 13th. And the speaker then will be Kevin Fu. Kevin is currently doing a one-year tour of duty for the FDA as the Director of Medical Device Cybersecurity and Radiological Health, as well as the Program Director for Cybersecurity Digital Health Center of Excellence. So do also come to that. That should be a really good, we're doing that in a fireside conversation style. After that, we are then transitioning into summer mode, and we will be reading papers. I think this year we are thinking of having the papers we choose have some general overarching theme. And so if you have some theme ideas, please let us know, and we can sort through them and then settle that down. So anyway, welcome here. Sean, it's back to you.
Yes, and thank you for that, Dean Marzullo. And just to clarify, the reading group is something that will come together and we'll talk about and discuss papers in the sort of virtual environment. And if it's physical, we may have people there. So it could either be virtual or hybrid. So stay tuned for that. Now, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Jason Nurse. He's requested that if you like, you can refer to him as Jason. Jason is an associate professor in cybersecurity at the University of Kent and a visiting academic at the University of Oxford. His research explores the interdisciplinary nature of cybersecurity, privacy, and trust. This especially considers the impact of new technologies on these areas. As a result of this broad remit, Dr. Nurse, or Jason, has had the pleasure of working across various domains, including cybersecurity, psychology, and computational social science. Jason has authored over 100 peer-reviewed articles, and he regularly speaks on cybersecurity in the mainstream media, including Wall Street Journal, BBC and BBC Radio 4, Newsweek, Wired, Info Security Magazine, The Register, Naked Security, and The Conversation. If you'd like, you can reach out to him. He has his email and Twitter handle posted on the slides. And for those that might not be able to see them, his Twitter is @JasonNurse, or you can find him online at jasonnurse.github.io. And with that, Jason, the ball is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind of amazing introduction, Sean. And thank you, Dean Marzullo. I think I got your name right. Hopefully I did. And thank you everyone for turning up to listen to my talk today on this topic, a topic that's kind of quite important to me, where it really kind of explores a quite, I guess, multi and interdisciplinary piece of work looking at cybersecurity in general, but also kind of a topic that is rarely discussed, if I'm very frank. Looking at this kind of topic of corporate communication and what does it mean, and how should companies actually go about engaging after a cyber attack. So to start things off, I know that some people out there will probably be interested in following on and probably a little bit closer to my talk and what I'm going to discuss. If you haven't had a chance to have a look at the research paper which this talk will be based on, I have kind of some images up on screen and some links up on screen. There's a link to the full paper on Elsevier, and there's a link to a preprint, and there's also a link to a white paper. And the white paper has actually been created because since I did this work, a number of people, a number of organizations in particular, has been very, very interested. And I created a white paper to be able to provide almost like a scaled down version of this work that organizations and companies and businesses and even members of government can pick up very quickly and use as a point of reference in terms of how they should respond after a cyber attack. So let's jump right into it. So on the screen right now, you'll see a quote, which some of you might be familiar with. For those of you that are not, so this is a quote, and it centers in on what I think is really important, what the angle that I'm coming at in this bit of work. And as you can see here, it says, I'm convinced that there are only two types of companies, those that have been hacked and those that will be, and even they are converging into one category, companies that have been hacked and will be hacked again. And the nature of what I'm trying to propose here or highlight here is that we can do all we want in security to try to prevent cyber attacks, to prevent data breaches to prevent security incidents. But an unfortunate reality is that as cybersecurity professionals, researchers, and so on, we need to be on the ball 100% of the time, and attackers only need to be successful once. And what this means is that often it's really a case that you will get breached at some, but even if you try as hard as you can, just the nature of cyber attacks, even the nature of the numbers means that you will get breached. And with that in mind, I just wanted to pick up some good examples, some few examples here, and this kind of narrows into the fact that, well, okay, if at some point you will get breached, it's really important to start to consider what should you do after it. How should you respond as an organization? How should we even actually look at this from a research perspective and trying to understand what does good response look like as a holistic thing. So this is one example, and this is from a while ago, so 2015, quite a while ago, completely agree. And here, so in the UK, we had a breach of a big ISP called TalkTalk. And what I want to zero in here on is the fact that the TalkTalk CEO went on, I think it's national television or national radio, I can't remember which one. And the key quote that many people remember after this breach was this quote here saying, "I can't confirm that customers' data was encrypted." And why this is important is that it highlights this place where this very large organization was not sure after a breach had occurred whether data was encrypted or not encrypted. And you might assume that, well, this is something that an organization should definitely know. But one of the realities, one of the stark realities here is that, well, at this point in time, potentially, there was not this understanding. And this, of course, is a big thing because we need to be able to kind of respond from a technical perspective, but also socio-technical perspective. And this is part of the socio-technical problem in actually engaging with the media. But let's kind of use that just as a platform to jump off into something else. So here you see another image, and this is, I apologize for the quality of this image, and this image is from, once again, back in those times, 6 years ago. And why I want to zero in here is on is that this fact. Let's look at the conversation. So this potential customer of TalkTalk says, "A bit disgusted to read about this in the paper. Informing your customers privately should have been the first priority." And this is a Twitter thread. So you see here this person reaching out to the TalkTalk customer care and saying, "Hey, why am I now finding out a potential breach of my data via the newspaper? Why have I not been contacted directly? Why was that not your first priority?" And then there's a response here. "I want to tell as many people as possible." So, and it goes on to talk a little bit about being on the radio and so on and so forth. And once again, the customer comes back and says, "This is not good enough. This happened yesterday. I could have canceled my card and had I been informed." And this hints at what I'm exactly trying to get at here. And that's the reality that, well, what should actually organizations do is publicizing things only on the media, doing a live interview on television. Is that good enough? Here you can see potentially that is not good enough. And this customer had expected some direct communication. And you see this kind of trend in the media time and time again. You might have heard about the Equifax data breach, and 147 million impacted. And what is here actually is, what's interesting here is how long Equifax took to respond to the breach, as you can see here, based on this Wall Street Journal article, and then also separately the fact of how they responded and how their response was perceived, in that they chose to potentially go with this other domain name, as you can see here, which was actually flagged as phishing. There were reports saying that the official Twitter account actually mistakenly tweeted the wrong link to potentially phishing websites. And this also highlights, once again, well, does this company know how to respond properly when it comes to communication? And to give some example, this is from Krebs on Security. He notes, if you access actually the breach website from a phone versus from a laptop, you would actually potentially get different messages about whether you were impacted or not by the breach. So this is really highlighting some of the real issues here. And once again, time and time you see that. So Travelex, another big organization, this time in much more focused on finance. It was 17 days after the cyber attack that their CEO actually went and actually basically brief the world that they were going through this and this is how they were impacted. So there was a long period of time where customers couldn't access their services, business partners couldn't access their services, and there was this really big question about, well, what's going on? Why is no one informing us? Why is no one communicating to us what has happened to the breach? And as you can see here, it also led to some disgruntlement between employees. So the key question that drove this bit of research I was involved in, or I kind of led, looking at what does effective corporate communication or public relations, PR, look like after a cyber attack? How should a company actually respond? What should they say? How should they say it? Who should they interact with, and so on? So to do this, I conducted a bit of work. And when I say I should mention, this was a bit of work with the Matter student and myself. And what we did was we conducted kind of a number of different kind of small studies and kind of just larger approaches you can see here. The first was a systematic review of literature. So this is us kind of going through the academic literature on the topic of how to communicate after a data breach and going through that kind of quite systematically. We also looked at analyzing a number of real world cases, and we basically took the outputs of both of these in terms of one provided academic best practice, and the other one provided actually industry best practice. We evaluated, compared and contrasted these, and then we actually produced a number of kind of best practice guidance, which we then actually used to develop our framework in terms of the thing we're proposing to actually allow companies to communicate better after an incident. So now we'll go through those in a little bit more detail. So first, systematic literature review, and many of you listening might be familiar with this. So what we did was basically we searched for relevant articles across a number of large-scale databases. We looked at kind of popular ones such as, from a computing perspective, things like ACM, a digital library, IEEE Xplore. But we also, of course, given the nature of the work, we also looked at more interdisciplinary sources such as Business Source Complete and a few others, which you can find in the full academic article. And what we did was we analyzed these from the perspective of using the keyword security incident, public relations, communications, so on and so forth. And we found in the end kind of over 3,000 articles, as you can see here, and we eventually filtered these down to try to identify a core set that were really based on providing best practice and guidance for how companies should respond after that a breach occurred or a security incident occurred. So there were 45 articles that we found, and we then analyzed these using kind of thematic content analysis. So we basically went through and actually looked for key themes across the different academic articles. And then we try to extract key themes, especially focused on best practices. So what should companies do in the case of a cyber attack, having been breached by a cyber attack? So now there are a number of notable themes that came out. I'm only going to give you a subset now for time's sake. So some notable themes: stock market reaction. That was probably one of the biggest ones, because we saw a number of academic articles looking very much at this correlation, which I'm sure many of us have been interested in, that when a company is attacked, if a company is breached and they state it publicly, what happens with the stock price? This has been a big question for a while, and looking at this, I guess, long-term kind of cyber harm that potentially emerges due to a cyber attack, in that if a company is breached, does its stock price be impacted? If its stock price is impacted, for how long? Almost kind of teasing out this question of, can a cyber attack actually lead to a business going bust? So that was a big question. There were a number of articles also looking at legal requirements, message framing, protecting reputation, negative emotions, and so on. I think one of the most interesting was message framing, in terms of how do you actually frame the message? How do you say that we had a breach, and how do you frame that in a way such that it doesn't actually have more negative connotations for the organization, especially hinting and impacting things like the organization's reputation in the eyes of their stakeholders and customers in particular. So here are some of the best practices that were extracted from that bit of work. So one being, must demonstrate commitment to stakeholders and to addressing the problem. And that was quite key when it comes to demonstrating commitment to stakeholders, in that, yes, the organization was breached, but it's also important to try to engage and to reassure stakeholders almost about what's happening and what's going on. Multi-jurisdictional complexity was a big one, especially because what we found was that organizations, especially the typical organization, has customers all over the world. So therefore, it's not a case of, okay, a company has been breached. Okay, what do we need to do with these 100,000 people that have been impacted because they're all from the same place. It's more a company has been breached. Okay, 10% of the 10% of the customers impacted live in Europe, 20%, 30%, 40% in the US, and then so on so elsewhere. And I think why that's really interesting and really important is because each of those jurisdictions might have different disclosure requirements in terms of how you should tell customers about the data breach, and especially when you should actually disclose this to them. So this kind of idea of disclosure rules. Of course, the US is potentially even more complex given the different rules in different states. Communication message framing, so that's one that I already mentioned. One thing that was interesting in particular there was that some articles actually suggested blaming the attacker, in that you can frame it as, well, we as an organization are victims of the attack, just like the customer's data, like the customers whose data we hold. So both the customers and yourselves are victims, and it's the bad hackers over there or the bad attackers over there. They're the ones that really, where all the blame should be focused on. So that was one thing that came out as well as a way to approach this question of framing. There was also kind of this last question about kind of emotional impact, and that came out simply because some articles really highlighted the fact that often what happens when it comes to data breach is that you get an organization saying, oh, okay, well, the data was lost, but we'll provide you with credit monitoring services. But the reality is often that credit monitoring service only help solve part of the problem, that there might be significant emotional impacts on individuals. So for instance, there was a IT incident or breach, I think a few years ago, and it basically meant the organization had to stop operating for a period of time, and it was a bank. And the concern there is that, well, if a bank stops operating for a point in time or has to block people's accounts for a point in time, that simply means that people can't actually withdraw money, whether people have to actually pay for goods, pay for groceries, pay for rent. All this kind of stuff actually can be important as well and should be considered in the context of a data breach. So then what we kind of did, the next thing was to think about, okay, now we have academic best practice, let's try to get some industry best practice. From an industry perspective, what's needed, what's important, what should be considered. So what we did next was we branched out and we tried to look at a number of case studies across a number of organizations that had been breached. And we tried to see what was, how did they approach communication and how actually was that communication perceived by others? In terms of, did others perceive their communication about the incident as good, bad, indifferent? What were the perceptions? So on screen now you see a number of organizations who have suffered a breach of some kind. And this is just an example. So I'll talk a little bit now about how we actually went through the incident or kind of case identification process. So what we did was the UK government, the National Cybersecurity Centre, they have kind of weekly threat reports where they basically document threats that have occurred, not only necessarily in the UK, but threats that have occurred that are noteworthy in some way, shape, or fashion. And what we did was we took that as a basis, we went back a number of years, and then we kind of reflected on that and we tried to find key references of data breaches. And then we tried to actually focus specifically on UK-centric data breaches. Simply for this, the reason for this is simply to help narrow the scope. Because if we consider the whole world at the same time, we're kind of assuming that culture and stuff like this is constant, which obviously it is not. So for this, we focus really on UK data breaches, and we use these threat reports to identify these UK data breaches. And then we actually reflected on threat reports once again, and we tried to actually find out individual third parties that also were cited in these threat reports. And why we try to use these third parties, or what we call expert commentators, are assuming that NCSC is a really good source of, one, noteworthy data breaches, and any third parties that they cite to actually help write this threat report are kind of quite competent and quite well known. For us, that was kind of a good baseline to which we can actually extract a series of commentators. So then we basically compare and contrast. So we've had a number of data breaches that we thought were interesting, and we had a number of kind of third-party commentators or experts in the field that had commented on data breaches, and we just basically tried to combine those such that for every data breach we thought was important, we had the expert commentary on that data breach in terms of how they actually were able to respond. Now here are the kind of organizations that we focused on. To the left of the screen, and then to the right of the screen, we have a sample of the expert commentators that we actually used. So you can see, big companies such as Deliveroo, British Airways, Dixon Carphone Warehouse, Ticketmaster, Deloitte, and so on. And then on the right, you see, presumably, hopefully, well-known names to some of you at least, of Schneider on Security, Krebs on Security, Troy Hunt, Graham Cluley, Chris Vickery, Ars Technica, We Live Security, CyberScoop. And like I said, the main point of identifying these commentators were that these commentators offer some expert insights and reflection on how these organizations responded to their data breach in terms of comms and PR. So once we had that, and we went through, we basically documented all of the expert opinions, from which were across a number of different websites, a number of different web pages, and also in some regards, actually, we also had to transcribe some podcasts in particular. So we had a fair amount of qualitative data. And then what we did here, once again, was go through the same process. So we did basically thematic analysis to try to identify the key themes, to also hint towards key best practices. So some of the key things coming out, firstly, you had credibility of statement being important, in that some organizations were making statements that were potentially not viewed as credible, in that they were making statements that were not backed up by data. Then you have this question of downplaying. Downplaying was actually quite significant, because downplaying basically is this idea of the organization communicating, oh, the breach wasn't so bad, or oh, that many people were not impacted by the data breach. And of course, that was a thing that many commentators weren't really keen on hearing or keen on seeing, and criticized quite heavily. Excuse me. Then you have kind of not disclosing or delaying. That was another thing that came up, popped up as quite significant. This point of organizations potentially trying to hide a breach had occurred, or delaying it as much as possible, so therefore not telling customers that a breach had occurred. Admission of responsibility is also a big one. This question of, as an organization, should I accept responsibility, or should I just blame someone else? That was a big question that was asked, because we saw a lot of organizations basically saying, it's not my fault that I was attacked, or I was breached just like you were, and so on and so forth. And then this question with previous breaches in the organization and the impact that could potentially have. So extracting from that, focusing on a number of best practices, we found, for example, be prepared being quite significant in that, and this links to actually the credibility of statements, in that when an organization makes a statement, they should actually be sure that they have evidence to back it up, and then that the statements that they make are actually based on facts and not based on guesses or assumptions, as some of them actually were. Then there was this big thing about accepting responsibility, so avoid blaming hackers and attackers and so on. And the position from the security experts or the expert commentators was that not accepting responsibility makes the organization look bad, because you were given the individual's data to protect, to hold, to use, to process, and so on. You should be the one that accepted responsibility. It's not appropriate for you as an organization to say, oh, well, we were breached and we lost the data. It wasn't really our fault. It's the hackers, or it's the partners, whoever were involved. It's really more important to accept responsibility and try to put things right as soon as possible. Then you have kind of this idea of kind of ensuring that customers are minimally impacted. That was important as well, because it's not only a case of if the breach occurs, leaving as it is, it's all about acting on that and trying to put things in place to make it right. And then lastly, kind of this point about communicating sooner rather than later is preferable. So then what we did was we took these best practices from literature and best practices from commentary and compared and contrasted them. And basically in most scenarios, or many of the scenarios, what we found were that they mapped on quite nicely, which is the first thing at the top. In some scenarios, there was no mapping in between them, so we can actually take both from each side. And in some scenarios, there were actually conflicts. And here you can see one conflict at the bottom, where it basically is from some of the key literature. They were saying that communication that framing is critical, yes, but not actually in the framing, the customer should focus more on blaming the attacker. Whereas from the expert commentary, it was very much of that is a bad approach, and the organization should accept responsibility. In a situation such as that, we basically try to understand the strength of the argument both ways and then take a judgment decision in what we think was best or what we think was preferable. And in some situations like this one, we went with the expert commentary. So here, as you can see on screen, a quick flash up of the first version of the playbook that was developed based on the best practices that we identified before. So remember, once we had best practices, then we tried to kind of create a structure almost that companies can actually use. Here you see it broken down into before a crisis and what should be done, and then in the crisis response, what should be done. So this is just to give you a first example of what version 1 looked like. But then what we did was we went out and we tried to engage with a number of senior security professionals. Because of course, if we had only put forward the framework version 1 based on the systematic review and the computational analysis, you might view that as, well, that's quite weak. That's just an idea that you propose with no background, no evaluation, no validation, anything like that. So what we did was we reached out to a number of very, very senior security professionals in organizations to try to get some understanding of, okay, this framework and how it looks. Do you think this would work? Do you think this would gel properly with the internal processes you have when it comes to incident response and crisis communication? And we focus specifically on very, very high-ranking individuals in organizations. So you see here on screen, this is the final set of participants. We reached out to many, many more, but given the nature of persons we were looking for, we were happy to at least get a sample of 13. You see a number of chief information security officers, a number of CISOs, a number of heads of security or cyber. You see a number of directors and so on of some very, very large organizations. So these are the individuals that actually reached out to us and engaged. And we basically got them to analyze the framework, reflect on it, and give us their feedback. And then we basically incorporated that feedback to produce the final version of the framework. And this is kind of it now. And that's it in a more slightly more flashy format. So now what I'm going to do is for the next 5-10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk you through a little bit of a high level, the different components of the framework. So firstly, there is this point about pre-event. So here the question is, what should organizations do before an incident happens? And here you can see a rough breakdown of the framework and how I've crafted it. Here you have a number of things to consider. You have guidance, and those are kind of how the kind of main categories of how it's broken down. So before an incident, organizations should try to establish key priorities in the case of if an incident occurs. And that might involve something like try to minimize the damage to the organization. So what steps would need to be placed to minimize damage? What steps would be placed to minimize cost to the organization? From that, we also kind of move on to this point about determining security gaps to inform crisis communications response. And that's kind of having things in place. So for example, if you had done audits all along, then you should be able to very quick audits and kind of have appropriate logs all along. You should be able to quickly identify what data was lost, whether it was encrypted or not, and so on and so forth. Also kind of course, as much as possible, things like multi-factor authentication are very, very beneficial because they can actually reduce the attack surface. In the middle, in terms of guidance, we have this point about really, really important, establish kind of cross-organizational, cross-functional crisis teams. It's not only the security team, it's not only the IT team. You know, security, as we all know, is not an IT issue. Cyber is not an IT issue. It's much larger than that. So it's really important to have these cross-functional teams, and really also important to try to understand where a customer's based, where a client's based, where a stakeholder's based, and what jurisdictions are important to their engagement. Really, really important to do. And if you have a database before, a database with all the information beforehand, as I suggested here, it makes the responding in the situation of an event actually much more efficient. Also, key things like having a number of key internal specialists identified, and actually having even simple things such as having a number of rehearsals and kind of templated responses for how you should actually respond after a breach occurs. Then on the right-hand side, you see a bit more information, key things such as incorporating partners. Partners are really important. We saw some scenarios that really didn't go on very well, where partners and businesses engaged in some quite public disagreements regarding data breaches, and that doesn't look good for the morale of the organization or for the organization's general reputation. And then also kind of this key point about rehearsals. Rehearsals are, it's obvious how important they are, but still we get organizations doing rehearsals once every year. Whereas even the nature of cyber means that we need to be much more efficient in how we act and be much more effective in how we respond. So something actually much quicker would probably be more appropriate. And this kind of just presents that in a bit more detail, but I don't think we need to zoom per se. So the next phase is crisis response. And here you can see here, if there's a breach, then what we suggest with the framework is, one question you can ask is the disclosure mandatory? So do you need to tell someone about this, or how do you need to tell them about this? Some basic questions, who is impacted? Is the data sufficiently encrypted? How much data has been lost? Are there industry-specific rules about how the organization should respond? And all of that information can actually be found if you had this knowledge database beforehand prepared. And even in situations where you might decide, well, actually, all this stuff is fine, Jason, maybe we don't actually need to disclose. So therefore, the answer might be no to those questions in terms of whether disclosure is mandatory. However, one of the key things that we found, and that was kind of quite salient in the research, is that in a number of situations, it's actually better for you to disclose anyway, simply because it actually make the organization actually look a bit better, in that if you hide things and are found much later, it actually looks much worse for you as an organization. So it shows that you're kind of taking security seriously. And then also even in 1 or 2 situations, we found that there were cases where an organization did not disclose the breach, and then there was a whistleblower who actually publicized the breach anyway. And then once again, the organization looked much worse because it looks like they were being breached, and then they were also hiding the reality that they had been breached. So then if you had to decided to disclose, then the question is what to disclose. And in this regard, there are kind of key guidance from regulatory requirements. That should be very clear. The data subject should be considering who has been impacted and how they would feel about this data breach and how you should respond. And then also, of course, the media perspective, and that the media will be very, very keen on, firstly, how large is the breach? How significant is it? What type of data has been lost? These will be kind of 2 key questions that the media will be very interested in. So you do need to think very carefully about how you frame and how you engage on those topics. And then if I kind of jump now to the framing the message. So the point here is to try to understand, okay, you will disclose, so how should you actually go about framing the message of this disclosure? Top thing, as you see here, accept responsibility. We really strongly suggest this and suggest apologizing. And I know I've actually engaged with quite a few lawyers on this point regarding whether it's right to disclose, whether it's right to accept responsibility and the legal ramifications of that decision. We suggest that it's better to actually accept responsibility, because generally speaking, especially when it comes to engaging with customers, you are viewed as the custodians of their data. So you should try to make it clear that you're sorry for what's happened, and you will try to put things right as soon as possible to make things better. Avoid downplaying the incident in situations where we saw organizations saying, oh, well, the incident isn't so bad. We only lost 10,000 records, or it was only name and I don't know, email address or something. We found in those situations, the organizations were actually viewed quite poorly, because it was almost like, okay, well, you don't value the data. You as an organization don't value the data you were given, and you don't want to protect it as such. So you're downplaying that it's not such a big problem. We found that really didn't respond quite well, which is why we say avoid downplaying. Avoid blaming others. This came up quite a bit. Avoid blaming hacker groups, others, and so on, because yes, you're trying to maybe shift the blame to someone else, but sometimes that doesn't work, simply because in one situation it gives them the limelight, and secondly, it doesn't work that well for you in terms of you being the person that should have held this data secure and protected. Avoid blaming service partners. And this is also a big one, because we saw 1 or 2 incidents where an organization publicly said, oh, well, yes, we were breached, but we the code that we used, the code that led to the breach was not our code. It was provided to us by a third party. And while that's a maybe perfectly legitimate argument, what happened in that scenario, which is actually quite interesting, but quite unfortunate, is that the supplier publicly said, well, actually, yes, the code is ours, but if you had told us that you were going to put the code on that page, we would have told you definitely don't do that because it's not secure. And then once again, it looked worse for that organization, once again, more publicly, because there was this very big public messy disagreement, which didn't do the organization or its reputation any good. Then on the right-hand side, in terms of things to consider kind of aggravating factors. So previous data breaches, if you've had them, immediately the knee-jerk reaction is going to be, are you really taking people's data serious, or data protection seriously, or security seriously? And also kind of other things such as, how are you working with law enforcement to resolve this issue? Can you share lessons? And then also even things like taking the account age, gender, cultural differences, stuff like that into account. And the key thing is here that try to understand and know who your customers are that have been impacted, and do what works for them in your response. You want to assure them, you want to engage with them, the customers, and this of course means customers, but even stakeholders in general, and this could be business partners, media, and so on. So then there's this point about choosing when to disclose. And here, generally speaking, the guidance we provide is disclose publicly as quickly as possible. And it basically helps individuals impacted feel less vulnerable, because they know that they have been impacted and they can act as appropriate. As you saw in the first example that I started the presentation with Taught, you saw how the person there was basically saying, why did you not tell me? I could have responded, I could have done something. Of course, though, we do appreciate that sometimes the organization might not have all the information they want. So there's a question about balancing accuracy with timing, and also, of course, also considering the appropriate regulations that might come into play, depending on where the organization is based. Selecting how to disclose, there are a number of different direct and indirect methods that we try to include, and we try to give the pros and cons to. Email can be great because email can be quite direct. But one of the most interesting things we found with email is that if you're a large organization and 90% of your customers are on Gmail, and you have to you're almost kind of sending hundreds of thousands of emails to Gmail at one point in time. One thing that was flagged up was, well, what if Gmail all of a sudden, or whatever email provider, views this as potential spam and starts to block emails? Of course, that isn't a great situation. As we saw with the example with Equifax, getting the website right is really, really important as well. But there are also other things to be considered. Social media can be great, especially for certain demographics, but it also can result in kind of quite negative interactions and spirals. The Twitter storm we all know and probably have potentially experienced. And then traditional media, of course, that can be quite broad as well and quite useful. The key thing we'd suggest there is always having a list of trusted journalists that you can work with to try to not necessarily spin the story in your favor, but at least kind of honestly report on what has happened and highlight that you're trying to get to the bottom of it. And the last one, being prepared for reaction. Briefing staff, really important. We found that in a number of scenarios, what happens is that organizations focus quite a bit on on the customer, so the external interaction, and almost completely forget about staff internally. Really important to brief staff because they can get quite disgruntled and quite frustrated about what's going on. And as we saw before, they can publicly go to the media and actually highlight, hey, inside the organization, it's not really going that well. Sufficient call centers, social media, so that you can actually manage the worries and concerns of individuals. And there's many, many more, as you can see here, putting measures in place to disrupt phishing scams and attempts. And then particularly when it comes to delivering the message, keep messages clear and easy to understand. I've seen a number of very, very complex messages released from organizations where customers don't even know whether they have actually been impacted or the extent to which they have been impacted, because there's a generic email that says, oh, you may or may not have been impacted or something like that. So it's really important to keep things simple, avoid jargon, and basically inform individuals of what has happened and what they need to do, if anything. And then lastly, kind of ensure a more senior person delivers the message potentially to the media, to the public, and so on. And this helps to show that your organization is taking the data breach seriously and actually taking security seriously. If there's a very junior person giving the message and they maybe flinch a bit, they're not really sure what to say, the junior journalist asks them a question and they don't know how to respond, it just looks really, really bad for the organization. So it's really important to get these things in place. And this goes back to one of my earlier points where I was talking about rehearsals and the importance of getting that done, getting a trusted journalist on board that can actually help you engage and communicate the message as appropriate. So that was my kind of last slide on the framework. I just wanted to highlight as well that I've had the opportunity to actually engage with, since I published this work, I've had the opportunity to engage with a number of organizations. So I've written an article on info security. I've also been had the write-up of this article in the Register, if some of you know the Register, and some other organizations at the bottom. You can see all these places are places where I've given talks on this topic, especially on kind of this idea of security incident PR and comms after incident has taken place. And I think generally speaking, there has been a really great take up the work, and it really makes me quite happy, to be honest, because I think this is one of the areas that is largely forgotten. I think often when people are discussing a security incident and how to respond, the natural thing is to think, well, okay, what do we need in terms of forensics? What do we need in terms of actual IR and response capabilities? There has rarely been this discussion or focused discussion on, well, what should the company say and how should the company go about saying it? And these are really, really important things. I think that are really, really key and critical, especially if from the perspective of socio-technical research. So that's my last That's my last slide. This is my last slide. So thank you very much for listening. And at this point, I'd open to any questions that anyone may have. Do feel free to reach out to me. As Sean mentioned, my email address is here, and I'm also quite active on social media, Twitter in particular. So do feel free to drop me a line or to connect. But I pass it back over to you, Sean, now, in case there are any questions.
Yeah, we have one already queued, and I've got a couple are starting to come in. So the first question comes from John, and this is more of a broad question for you because John's a freshman and exploring a few paths, one of which is involving cybersecurity and cyber attacks. And I was just wondering if you had any specific books you can recommend to help him explore this space.
So there are some books that are, I guess, more technical than not. One book that I'm aware of, and I'm aware of it especially because it is, I think the earlier versions are freely available. I think it's called Security Engineering. I think I have a version, a hard copy of it somewhere around here. So it's called Security Engineering. It's by, I think, Ross Anderson. He's a professor at Cambridge. And the book, I think, covers a lot of the key topics when it comes to cybersecurity. It covers topics that are more focused on, it has probably more of a technical slant, but it does have in some components that actually focus on the kind of more socio-technical aspects of cyber.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Samantha asks, most of this is corporate response. Has Dr. Nurse also considered incident command designs that include some level of government control or involvement with public communications? And I'll have a probe of my own once you're done with that.
Sorry, can you repeat that one?
Sure. Samantha asks, most of this, your presentation, is corporate response. Has Dr. Nurse also considered incident command designs that include some level of government control or involvement with public communication?
Yeah, so I think the short answer to that is no, and I think that is something that can be further explored. I think as soon as you start to engage with, I think in the probably the key application area I can think for, I think it's what Samantha had mentioned, would be if the organization is potentially a government body, where their government body or they are a part of the critical national infrastructure, where there would be much more sense for an organization to work closer with the government and with the government in terms of how to respond. So I think that is definitely an area that should be explored and can be explored further, but it's not an area that I focused on, simply because generally speaking, what I've found is that sometimes, especially if you're giving on kind of government focused, talking about CNI, critical national infrastructure and stuff like this, then there are all types of other concerns that need to be considered. And the government, for example, might want to, for example, control things much more carefully, given the involvement and given potentially who the attackers are. Because of course, attacking the critical national infrastructure can quite quickly be seen as the attack on a country. And that often is treated a little bit differently than attack on a organization within a country.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. To follow up on that, I noticed some of the experts you had that had these long tenures in security and IT seem to all come from very large organizations as well. Do you think your playbook and whatnot will apply equally for smaller organizations and companies as well, or is this mainly for companies at large scale?
Yeah, great question. So based on the testing of it, of course, as you rightly pointed out, it's more focused on larger organizations. And the reason why we did that was actually somewhat intentional, because we engaged with smaller organizations a bit in the beginning. What we found was that small organizations don't have security people, well, depending, of course, the size of the organization, have much smaller security teams, have much smaller security people, so security functions, let's say. And what we found was that two things. One, unfortunately, they struggle to even focus on the key security components firstly, especially when we talk about SMEs. So they are still at the point where they're trying to get the basic incident response right. So what we're focusing on in terms of corporate incident response and kind of focus from a comms perspective, for me, it's something that could come at this same time, but probably a bit after. I think from now, what I'll probably like to focus on a bit more is actually trying to get the basics for them in terms of what is good cyber hygiene, what is good cybersecurity practice. Then once we have that basis, then we can build on things like communication. And I think the second part of that is that what we've found, I'm not sure if it's the same in the US, but what we found is that often, and for smaller organizations, a lot of their security function is actually outsourced. And that complicates the matter quite a bit, because there's a question of, this small organization, small SME, they basically give their security function to another organization to manage. So in the UK and I think in Europe, they call MSSPs, Managed Security Service Providers, and they can often handle and manage a lot of the security functionality. So what you see is actually in those situations, it being even more difficult to actually engage with SMEs on topics like this. But I do think that, so subsequently to doing the work, we've engaged with some smaller organizations, and there's clearly some scope for it. But what would probably need to happen, this is something I'm going to work on towards the future as well, is potentially having I like to call it a light version of the framework, in that if you're a smaller organization, here are some of the key things you need to consider. You don't have to consider all of these things, because I appreciate the framework is quite substantial in itself, but here are some of the key things you should be considering and you should be doing as you try to prepare and respond in terms of comms to a cyber attack.
Thank you. Kush asks, how often NIST guidelines do industrial academic experts use while communicating breaches or similar events? And I understand NIST is more of a US agency for these standards. So if there's perhaps another component, ISO or other guidelines you could speak to.
So the question there is, how does NIST compare?
Yeah, so if I'm reading this correctly, Kush is asking the guidelines like a NIST or an ISO. So how often do these guidelines, are they being used by industrial and academic experts to help communicate breaches and similar events?
Yeah, so from what I've seen, very little, because from what I've seen, there is very little focus on these topics, on topic. Well, when I say these topics, I'm specifically focusing on comms, comms and PR. And I think so I'm familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework. I'm familiar with ISO. I'm familiar with some of the other NIST standards focused on security in particular. Even though this is, I guess, more US focused, it's quite well known over here in general. But from what I've seen, there's very little on this topic of corporate comms or just comms and PR. And when they say corporate comms, to me, to be honest, just corporate comms in some regard just means business comms, at least how I'm interpreting it. And what I think the reality is there is that for a number of these, and I think this is a historic thing with security actually, in that there's a slant towards focusing more on the technical side of things and the technical side of security to some extent, where yes, you have even the NIST considering some of the social components and even the concept of kind of risk management and incident response. These do contain some social sides, definitely. But when it comes to corporate comms, it has been this topic that hasn't been focused on, especially in the context of incident response. It seems to be a topic, I guess, that for whatever reason probably has been avoided for a long time, or has just not received that level of focus. But I've seen very, very little in the NIST standards, in ISO and so on, focusing on communication. It just isn't, I mean, to be honest, it's a very treacherous topic because it's, you know, it overlaps quite substantially with public relations, with marketing, with journalism, with communication studies. And these are massive topics where there's a massive overlap. And this is potentially why it hasn't been embedded or considered in the context of these wider standards or guidelines.
So essentially everything that's socio-technical is a hotspot, huh?
Yeah, well, to some extent, yes. I think that the hard part comes in terms of convincing others to focus on it, you know, because it's easier to focus on the more technical problems because they're so well known, at least from a security perspective.
Thank you. Wayne asks, as you note, breach awareness is not a snapshot, but a messy unfolding process of discovery. Did your research reveal any guidance on the right threshold point between certainty of attacks, such as credibility, versus urgent need to alert the public, like regulatory framing requirement or not? When are organizations sure enough?
Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant question. I think the reality is that the organization needs to be governed by a few things. One is, of course, the legal, the regulations based in the country or the region or those impacted. Two, engagement with law enforcement where and whenever possible. And then three, and I think this is why it relates, and this is why I emphasize so much in terms of that pre-incident, pre-event step, because one thing we recognize from doing the work initially, because we initially focused very much on post-incident and what needs to be done post-incident. And what we recognized was that, okay, well, ideally you notify as quickly as possible, but of course you need time to actually find out what has happened. And what we found was that, and why we emphasized actually ensuring that the organization has good auditing, good logs and so on in place is so that they can actually respond as quickly as possible and let the public know the public or customers know as quickly as possible what's actually going on. In terms of what's the perfect split, extremely hard to advise on that because all of these different moving parts. In some jurisdictions, law will come into place and your lawyers will tell you need to notify immediately because the law says where we are, you need to notify immediately. In those situations though, and one of the key things we highlighted is avoid overestimation, but also avoid underestimation. And I know that's very tricky and it's, you know, probably somewhat of a cop-out answer. But what we found is in situations where organization, we found both of these actually playing out in industry, I mean, in case studies. We've seen some organizations actually underestimating and going out really, really quickly and saying, right, we've had a breach yesterday or day before, whenever, and we think 1,000 records have been lost. But then what we've seen them do is 2 or 3 days later, and the media runs with it. And then 2 to 3 days later, they say, okay, we done some more in-depth studies, and actually it's not 1,000, it's 10,000. And then what happens is that the media runs with it again. And the media runs the story just like it was a news story. Well, you know, the organization doesn't know what's going on. They've now scaled up massively. But we've seen situations as well doing the opposite, where they start very high, so they start at 10,000 being lost, and then they tailor back. And in some situations, we actually see that doesn't get the additional media focus that in the first scenario it would have gotten. But in both situations, we just say, try to have the logs and appropriate softwares and the audits and so on in place so you can actually notify as quickly as possible. I think that's the thing, because as soon as you delay, one, you're risking that someone in the organization is gonna release it or whistleblow, and then two, it annoys people. It really, really annoys people. I mean, in Travelex situation we saw before, it was 17 days, and I remember that well, and I remember that it was many days, and you just saw. I think the message was system down for maintenance or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was, and that really annoyed people because people were thinking there were rumors that there was a breach, but the organization was not confirming or denying what was going on.
Thank you for that. One of the parts about your framework in the pre-event section, you talked about relying on cross-functional teams. And I'm wondering, of the organizations that you studied and the experts you've talked to, many organizations still have security in a siloed sort of operation. Compliance may or may not be part of security. Cross-functional teams are not something that occurs in many organizations. So how sensitive do you think your playbook is based on organizational structure and dynamics like that?
Yeah, so it's brilliant, once again, a brilliant question. And I think what I found actually, based on engaging with a number of individuals, both during lead up to that work of publishing that work, and actually after it, was, I remember one person said to me in particular after publishing the work and having a chat with them, in that they kind of held it up and said, okay, great, now I have something to go and actually use to start a discussion across my organization. Because often you get this perception that, once again, like you said, Sean, security is a siloed thing, in that it's an IT problem and, you know, they're in the basement somewhere. But one of the benefits with this was a framework, and actually in terms of actually engagement based on what we've seen, is that firstly, yes, this still does happen, in that security is still viewed as a separate siloed thing that happens by itself. But the organization that we dealt with, were doing better at that, in that they were being aware that, yes, actually security incidents, they do involve multiple teams from across the organizations. Lawyers will want to say, people in comms will want to say, people in the C-suite will want to say, security people will have a say, and so on and so forth. I think one of the biggest ones that came out was the importance of actually comms people in on these teams. So for some of the organizations we engaged with, it was clear that lawyers needed to be involved. It was clear that the security team needs to be involved because they're potentially managing the incident. What was less clear is the importance of things like the comms and marketing teams. And I think that was quite eye-opening. But you're completely right in that for many organizations, there's still this issue of the siloed nature of security. Organizations are getting better at it, and I'm really happy when that person said to me that the framework would actually prove and that could be used almost as a piece of tangible work to carry to other departments, and to say, here's clear evidence that we need to be working together, so that if a breach actually does occur, we know that we have a joint team that can actually respond to it.
Speaking of these joint teams, and this might be our last question depending on time allowance here. So I noticed you had a company like Deloitte listed up there in terms of the groups that you're talking about. So companies like Deloitte could be listed as both ones that have their own data to be concerned about in their breaches, but they're also consulting companies that are providing a variety of services, which could include comms and PR, damage control, these sorts of things. So how well do you think that they may take to your playbook here, that they may use it across a multitude of corporate clients versus a corporate client that just says, we're going to go ahead and adopt this? They'd have different thinking strategies, I would assume.
Well, potentially to different thinking strategies. I mean, to be honest, since I did a talk a few months ago, and there was a legal team, a crisis response team, but I think they were primarily lawyers that were involved in the breach counsel and so on. And they had actually mentioned that the framework was actually a good thing for them because, you know, to them it's their bread and butter. They know how to do it and they engage. But the good thing about it is because they have multiple clients in this particular space, it provides a basis for them to actually give to clients and say, well, here's a basis of what we can do, and here's how we might actually try to benchmark or standardize what we're doing across our number of different companies and organizations. So from that perspective, it actually can potentially work quite well. I mean, I haven't had a chance to gather additional intel from that organization to find out whether they were able to implement it and how they found it in terms of implementing it across multiple organizations. I think in general, it could work, and I can't see any reason why it wouldn't, to be honest. I think the key thing would be getting it implemented and as I'm hoping to do in later studies, actually kind of validate its application in kind of the real world as it may be.
All right. Thank you for that. We're now at the top of the hour here, and we're going to close out the presentation. Thank you, Dr. Jason Nurse, for the wonderful presentation, talk, and questions. And thank you, everybody, for attending. This video will be posted to YouTube later so you can watch it at full length. And so at this point, we'll go ahead and close out. Those of you that are attending the small group chat with us afterwards, you should have the link that was shared with you. So please leave this Zoom webinar and go to that regular Zoom room now. Thanks. Have a great day. Oh, and just that last pitch, May 13th, we have our last STC talk with Kevin Fu from the FDA and University of Michigan, where we're going to be talking about socio-technical perspective, lenses, and opportunities with medical device research and regulation. So, have a great day.
Thanks.